The Empire of Byzantium, that golden dream, the climax of ancient Rome and Greece. One emperor, one single faith. A dream that lasted for 1,000 years, a dream shattered by the armies of the West. The fame of Byzantium travelled from Iceland to China, from Ethiopia to Russia, to every kingdom on the earth. And at its centre, Constantinople, the world's great marketplace. Its fabled wealth, its gold, its emeralds, its palaces, its glittering churches. A legend so rich it caused its own destruction. Founded in the year 330, the Christian Empire of Byzantium had its centre here, in Istanbul, in modern Turkey. The Byzantines called this city Constantinople. 1,000 years ago, it was the richest city of them all, the eye of all the world. In the very centre, the ancient church of St. Sophia, converted now into a mosque. Here, the emperors of Byzantium met the King of Heaven, the lords of this world and the next, the centre of the Christian universe. Visions of this holy city and its golden emperors filled the mind and the imagination of every medieval prince and king until one day, an army of the Christian West came here and destroyed it. Beside the church, above the sea, a shadowed park with 5 centuries of buildings in it, the Palace of Byzantium. A 1,000 years ago, there were gold pavilions here, chapels, mansions, set in a sea of green. An earthly paradise. One of the most potent ancient legends of our planet, the home of God's emperor on earth. So where is the Holy Palace of Byzantium in modern Istanbul? That's a lump of it there. That sad, pathetic pile of brick. You have to go into the streets, into the alleyways. You really need a map. Look, I'll show you. Modern Istanbul. Why the map's always open the wrong way? Modern Istanbul, ancient Constantinople. I'll show you what I mean. Look, there's the great Roman roads coming into the centre of town, the hippodrome where the people met the emperor, the great church just beside it. And there, between that wall and that one there, that whole area was all palace. Dozens of buildings, dozens of churches, all together, high and glittering right across the hill. So you might ask, where the hell is it now? The Golden Palace is buried beneath old Istanbul. The little streets are haunted by its lost pavilions, by ghosts of ancient gardens, by the shadows of its courtiers and generals. The enormous curve of the imperial racetrack still stands though, a shattered wonder of the medieval world. We're right at the very heart of the palace of Imperial Byzantium, and there's a corner shop. Well, at least you could say the Byzantines invented corner shops. They had a law about them. There should be one in every street, they said, for the necessities of life. That there, though, that's something else. That's a part of the palace itself. Just part of the foundations, though. Once they held a great high terrace, not that tea house up there, where the emperors walked each evening in the fading light, their fine silks flowing gently in the fresh sea breezes. Constantinople was the greatest seaport in the medieval world. Arab, Russian, Viking and Italian boats once sailed along these walls. This is the ruin of an imperial pavilion, some 14 centuries old. The warm sea once splashed against these walls. Those are the doors through which the emperor once walked to board the royal yacht, the Greyhound. The emperors like to live beside the seaside, so it's always a good idea to, when you're walking along the seaside walls of Constantinople, to look and see if these little gates give you something of the entrance to the palace. Some of them don't look much today, but they're very interesting. See this Greek text? It's part of a Greek version of the book of Habakkuk. A text we know once was laid around the base of a great statue of the Emperor Justinian that stood in the centre of the city. So this then is not an ancient gateway, because that statue was still standing a few hundred years ago. Where on earth can we find the picture of the Palace of Byzantium? It's still here, of course, in its imitations, in echoes of the great palace of Constantinople that stand in Sicily and Spain, in Syria and Rome. Villas, gardens and verandas, all set like tents across the hill. Scented courtyards, splashing fountains, a world that ordinary people never saw. Some of their very stones were plundered from the golden palace of Byzantium. There were churches too, filled with the holiest of relics. Fragments of the true cross set in gold and blood-red rubies. And great jewelled cups made for the emperor's own communion. And at the heart, at the very centre of this magic palace, Byzantium's throne room, the throne room of the Emperor of Christendom. As you approach the imperial throne of Byzantium, you'd have felt as naked as a man on Judgment Day, utterly defenceless. The man who sat on that chair didn't rule by the will of God. He was the will of God on earth. He was God's instrument. He was divine providence personified. Some Byzantines believed that the end of world history would come when that man on that throne took his crown off and laid it on the rock of Calvary. It's probably the most total form of government the world has ever seen. You don't have, for example, participatory government in this. Who can participate in the will of God? You can only bow before it. You can't have morality or loyalty. You can't have good kings or bad kings, because who can know the workings of the will of this astonishing emperor? That is Byzantine politics. Byzantium
ruled with cosmic certainty. It didn't dominate its neighbours with vast armies, but with images of God and government, with bars of gold and promises of princesses in marriage and alliance, all dressed up in the silk robes of Byzantium. The Byzantines operated a kind of cultural imperialism, and at the centre of the show was Constantinople, the Golden Palace and its emperor, the rituals of its church and court. In the 10th century, diplomats and merchants, Easterners and Westerners, all give astonishing descriptions of a weekly procession that wound through the cloisters and the gardens of the palace, all filled with singing choirs, and ran up to the great church of St. Sophia. Behold the morning star, they sang, as the emperor approached. In his eyes the sun's rays are reflected. Adore him, ye nations, bow the neck to his greatness. The whole world agreed that this was the most magnificent, the most awe-inspiring sight on earth. At its ending, the procession passed up a wooden walkway that ran right up to the gallery of the great church and entered St. Sophia through this door. Here, high up in the gallery of St. Sophia, was the chapel of the emperors and the court. Below the balcony, in the incense and darkness of the ancient church, pilgrims from Asia, Africa and Europe visited and kissed 1,000 holy relics, a little holy land of marble, gold and bronze. In this smaller private space above, the emperors held courtly services and were enrobed for the vast ceremonials that took place each week in the church below. And here they are still, the dynasties of old Byzantium, still walking in the grand procession from 1,000 years ago.
That's the Emperor John the Good up there, all decked out in his Sunday best and carrying a bag of gold for the church. He was a good king. He was from the Commagene family. It was a noble dynasty, died out in 1185. That's his wife, Irene. She was a Hungarian princess. See, she's got blonde hair. And that poor little weedy chap round the corner is their son Alexis. John desperately wanted him to succeed to the throne, but he died young. That person there is the most celebrated, most married monarch of the Macedonian dynasty, the Empress Zoe. Zoe ruled Byzantium in her own right in the 1050s. But Zoe also had royal blood in her veins, and she legitimised 3 successive husbands as emperors. That's the last of them, the pious Constantine IX. If you look closely, you can see that the head of that figure's been changed. I bet there were portraits of her other 2 husbands underneath. Now, the funny thing about this mosaic is that Zoe's portrait's been changed along with her husband's too. You know, some historians have said that she was very vain. Certainly she was beloved of the people of Constantinople, who thought her very beautiful. And you know, she was almost 60 when that portrait was made.
In the year 987, Russian ambassadors came south into the sun to see Byzantium. They told their prince, the ambitious Prince of Kiev, that they couldn't begin to describe the splendour of St. Sophia. They could only say that God dwelt here within it, and they were all baptized. Just as it intended, Byzantium had dominated its neighbours with pious splendour and magnificence. These Russians, though, were tough and warlike. Despite their newfound faith, they still hovered dangerously on Byzantium's northern borders. Rather than dispatch grand armies to subdue them, the Byzantines employed images of God and government. They built churches in Central Europe, the like of which the northerners had never seen. And sometimes, too, the Byzantines sent bishops and ambassadors, men laden with wisdom, relics and the word of God.
The Byzantines didn't like to travel north in the winter. The diplomats had to go sometimes with little bars of gold stamped with the emperor's name, wrapped in furs and stuffed under the sledge out of the way. The gold to bribe local chieftains to attack one another rather than to go and attack Constantinople. It was a terrifying journey. First of all, you went to a Byzantine border fort. There the governor tried to grab a few of the sons of the local princes to keep them under control. And then you set out across the icy wastes. When you met some villagers, you might give them some silk, brocade or pepper or leather. But always out there as shadows hiding in the woods with a pecheneg. These were ancient tribesmen who really prided themselves on killing travellers and drank from their gold-bound skulls that hung from the walls of their tents, so it was said.
After months of travel, you'd arrive at the side of the frozen river Dnieper and look up at the great fortress of the ruler of Kiev, the prince of the Varangian Rus. Before Byzantium, the princes of Kiev had all lived in wooden huts. These towers and domes and all the dreams they hold came here from old Byzantium. And the story of their making is an extraordinary tale.
This little area here was once the centre of Kievan Rus, a little stockade just 600 yards across. Now you've got to think it's the year 988. There's Prince Vladimir, a Byzantine bishop, and a lot of Byzantine craftsmen are coming out here. It's just before dawn. It's very cold. And at a particular holy moment, after a prayer is said, they plant the position of the altar. And then, as the sun comes up and a shadow is cast across the snow, a nobleman called Simon, so tradition tells us, took off a golden belt and they measured out 20 golden belt lengths. And that would be the first church in Vladimir's kingdom. It's an astonishing moment in history. It's the old technology of Greece and Rome, 1,000 years after those empires are gone, going into parts of the world that they had never managed to conquer.
Vladimir's church is gone now. There's still a few bits of the floor left, though. Some precious relics of a tremendous Byzantine achievement.
Dziękuję. You know, it's at times like this, archaeology really comes alive. Look, this isn't just a little old bit of brick or mortar or something. These are the first bricks ever laid in Central Europe. It's not just stone on stone either. This is like somebody got into a Cadillac and drove it into the middle of the Amazon and parked it in a village where nobody had ever seen outside people before. This is astonishing. Look, it's only a bit of ceramic and a bit of mortar. You need 2 separate kiln masters with 2 separate kilns for that. They have to find the lime to make the mortar. They have to go to the river to find the clay down the road here. They have to build their kilns, cut the trees. And then they got them cutting stone, local stone, hewn from open quarries for the first time. The Russians didn't like working stone. There's an old Russian proverb: it is easier to teach an ill-tempered wife than it is to cut stone. But actually, their real problem was the weather. The area was a mass of mud, and they had to devise incredibly elaborate wooden structures to hold the building up at all when they extended the foundations. So this is an extraordinary enterprise. How ingenious those people were coming from the south, how determined. It took them 8 years to get this place up. They learnt, though, the next time they built a church in 5 years.
This is the church they built, the Cathedral of St. Sophia of Kiev. Beneath the old Ukrainian domes, Byzantine brick and ancient Greek geometry. These could be the walls of an imperial church in ancient Constantinople. Inside, memories of the palace of all palaces and the church of all churches, the original St. Sophia at Constantinople. And gleaming mosaics too, made by Byzantine craftsmen sent here to work for Vladimir's son, Prince Yaroslav. Carefully preserved images of Jesus, Mary and the saints, images of government and holiness to pacify the north. The heavenly court of old Byzantium, floating high above the Prince of Kiev.
It's a heavenly court, now entirely mirrored in Yaroslav's new court on earth, aided and abetted by a Byzantine bishop who wants him to punish sinners, to feed the poor, and to fight the enemies of Byzantium. But there's something else going on in this wondrous building, something else yet more subtle. It's like a soap opera here. It imparts manner, it imparts gesture. It shows you the Byzantine way of walking and talking. And between that fierce structure and this new manner, the old order of Rus was entirely swept away. But you know, despite all that, the Byzantines never really trusted the Rus. They needn't have worried, though. The Russians had learnt their lesson very, very well indeed. And centuries later, when Constantinople itself had been thrown away, when Constantinople, the second Rome, had gone, then Moscow, the new capital of the Rus, declared itself as the third Rome.
Just as the dangerous northern tribes passed under Byzantium's golden spell, so did its southern European neighbours, in Greece and Italy and the islands of the Mediterranean. Venice, that ancient little town set on the mud banks of a North Italian salt marsh, was the owner of a powerful fleet of warships, as much a menace to Constantinople as were the tribesmen of the north. Beneath the stones of Venice, then, the bricks and columns, the technology and arts of old Byzantium. Just like Kiev, Venice's first churches and its most powerful images of God and government all came here from Byzantium.
It was truly terrible. It was either freezing cold, and they complained. This was the old Venetians' single most powerful portrait of the face of God. The Palla d'Oro,
made for the high altar of St. Mark's. It's a funny old thing, actually. It's cobbled up from all sorts of things. Gold strips, bits of jewellery, it's all there, like a magpie's nest. The single most beautiful things about this is these wonderful plaques of enamel. They're Byzantine imports. They were made in the imperial workshops in the year 1105, and they're probably copied from the decorations of a chapel in the imperial palace of Constantinople. That's Christ in the centre. All around him, and all in order, large to small, is laid out the court of heaven, just as Byzantium's foreign kings and princes decorated the emperor's court of Constantinople. If you were a useful ally for Byzantium, and you sent off 30 or 40 pounds of gold to Constantinople with a humble letter, the emperor might just honour you with some of these panels, pictures of God and your local saints, and portraits too of you amongst the golden prophets and the angels of Byzantium. This was the power of Byzantium abroad, its prestige, its foreign policy. This little chap here is Ordolafo Fallia, the ruler, the Doge of Venice. He's the man who commissioned the greater part of the Palo d'Oro. Now this is where you can start to see something of that provincial envy of Byzantium starting to work. That envy that almost rose up and threatened to destroy the great imperial empire. Look, I'll show you what I mean. There's the man, there's the Virgin Mary, and there you would expect the man's wife. But it isn't his wife. It is the Empress Irene of Byzantium. So what's going on here? Well, I think the Venetians have sort of rejigged it, so the dear old Doge of Venice, who by Constantinopolitan rights was a minor official on the edge of empire, suddenly popped up as, married to the great empress. They've also, the Venetians, cunning devils, given him a halo. You see, they've soldered a whole new head on there. The Byzantines would never have sent a figure of a local ruler with a halo on, so he's sort of really bumped up in the holy hierarchy here. But there's one thing the Venetians missed, and this is quite funny, because rulers in the celestial universe wear red socks. The Virgin Mary has red socks, the Empress has red socks, all the kings on this have red socks. But poor old Ordolafio doesn't. So he isn't really at the top of Byzantium's holy hierarchy. You don't think that's important? Ordolafo would have done. Deep down, he knew that the great Byzantine God that ordered everything within this Christian universe had seen that dubious halo. Also that this same God held the power of eternal life and death. By the Middle Ages, Byzantium's most powerful images of God and government had crossed the Mediterranean and penetrated Central Europe too. And always, at the very heart of this Christian universe, was the golden emperor of Byzantium and the glittering city of Constantinople. What did that legendary city really look like? In modern Istanbul, one single precious district of the city still holds something of the air of ancient Constantinople buried underneath it. Part built from the stones of the city's ancient marketplaces, Istanbul's bazaars still stand in Byzantium's thin streets. That old electric mix of races and religions, trades and professions is still here as well, just as it was 1,000 years ago.
Oh my God.
What are they then? Monsieur, sansü, Türkçe, sülük. Sülük.
Leeches.
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 Yes, leeches. Leeches.
So, clean your shoes, clean your blood.
Doctor, eczema.
Eczema.
Eczema. Rheumatisma.
That's amazing. Old Byzantine leeches.
Yes.
It's good for everything, right?
Yes.
Set between the East and West, Constantinople was the world's great marketplace, a living legend. Goods from Byzantium's bazaars are found today in excavations in Sweden and Afghanistan, in England and in Russia. And like Coke cans in the Gobi Desert, they give out a very special buzz.
Something for your constipation. Henna for your fingernails. And cumin. Everything the Byzantines had. Sultanas. Bet they didn't call it that.
In Byzantium, women mostly made the deals. Nowadays, though, the traders here are men. Baltic amber, African gold and ivory, Asian gemstones, Eastern silks and spices, and multinational traders, Italians mostly, buying and selling everything you could think of. There were fortunes to be made out of Byzantium.
You know, the weavers, the great silk bazaars of Byzantium have been famous for centuries upon centuries. In the West, they just had little bits of Byzantine silk and they used it to wrap the bones of saints and to put upon the high altars of cathedrals. So you can imagine that when a Western diplomat came here about 950 AD and actually bought 2 whole rolls of silk for his own clothes, that he was very pleased with himself. But when the bishop got to the borders, the Byzantine customs, took the cloth away from him. They said that even great Bishop Luidprand of Cremona, embassy of the King of Germany, wasn't grand enough to wear this fine fabric. You know, the Byzantines had a knack of making great kings feel like little lads from the country.
The old bazaars had ancient wisdom up for sale as well. In Byzantium's book market, the best part of the learning of the ancient world was copied out by publishers and merchants. And here it is still today, the oldest bookstore in the world.
You know, this is an amazing place. Just think, 600 years ago, there was a very famous Arab travel writer and he was coming through here, rummaging about in the bazaar looking for books. Ibn Battuta he was called. Anyway, there he was, rummaging around. There would have been more people here then, lots of scribes actually writing them. And a Byzantine magistrate who was walking through the square recognised him. And the old 2 men got together, the Arab and the Christian, and they sat down and they talked about writing books. They talked about travel and the joys of scholarship.
Westerners really loved the book bazaar in Byzantium. They could find things there that were real legends. Magical lost works like this, for example. This is a copy, Greek copy, of an ancient work made in Alexandria by an ancient Greek. It concerns the workings of the universe. Westerners only knew this from the talk of learned Arabs. Now, after visiting the bazaar, they could actually own a copy of Ptolemy's Alchemist. Books like the Alchemist gave algebra and chemistry to Western Europe. To Westerners, it must have seemed that all the wealth and wisdom of the world was held inside Constantinople and in the houses of the lucky people of Byzantium.
The Byzantines lived in a very face-to-face community. It was a very tight, enclosed world. They were incredibly superstitious, always looking for signs as they looked at each other, things that might change the meaning of their relationships with one another. The angle of a man's shoulders could tell you if he was having an affair. If you had a dream that you'd put on a pair of shoes and weren't going anywhere, it meant you might be getting married. You could nod at a woman and it meant that you would be having an affair with her very shortly. Superstitions everywhere. They divine the future by listening to thunder, but above all, they love charms and trinkets, things you can buy in bazaars, glittering treasures. And that is the greatest charm of all. It's been around for thousands of years before Byzantium, and it'll go on for 1,000 years beyond us all.
It's a charm against the evil eye.
The evil eye, of course, is envy. That thing that's so destructive inside small communities, and so destructive for Constantinople too. Constantinople was called the eye of all the world. Everybody envied its gold and silk and pretty princesses.
Not everybody, though, was allowed a glimpse of heaven. Poor old Bishop Luitprand of Cremona, who'd come to Constantinople for silks and for a Byzantine princess for his prince, hadn't got either of them. The Byzantines had lectured him upon the gross behaviour of his prince and sniffed at the very idea of sending an imperial princess to such a barbarous and distant kingdom. Luitprand greatly resented these haughty Byzantines, especially the great warrior emperor Nicephorus Phocas, who came to the throne in 963. You wouldn't want to meet him on a dark night, Bishop Luitprand reports to his prince. He's a monstrosity in a smelly old robe, a dwarf with the eyes of a mole, disfigured, disgraced, pig-like, an Ethiopian. Every week, Luitprand continues, like some crawling monster, the emperor walks in procession to the great church, and the singers cry, "Behold, the morning star approaches." They might just as well sing, "Come on, you burnt-out old coal, old woman, clod-hopping barbarian." As Western diplomats like Luitprand reported on the weakness of the emperors and on the 1,000 years of treasure in their city, so Western Europe's princes grew ever stronger, ever more powerful, and ever more envious of Byzantium. In 1204, the Venetians managed to divert a cutthroat army of crusaders from their sacred vows to capture Palestine for Christendom. Promising them the plunder of Byzantium, they provided lists of the treasures and the holy relics inside Constantinople. On the 13th of April, Venetian war galleys sailed up to the city walls, and the knights of France and Germany, of Italy and England, jumped from the boats onto the battlements. The campaign that followed was a nasty mix of treachery and chaos. At the ending, the city's walls were breached and the imperial throne was overturned. Many Byzantine nobles fled here, to the palace of Black and Eye, where they were besieged by Henry, the noble Prince of Flanders.
Now, the Venetians knew exactly what was in this palace. They even had an inventory of its contents. And when the nobles gave up the fight, they took everything they could out of the building. Gold, silver, precious jewels, silk, satins, ermine, minever. The haul was tremendous. More booty, it said, was taken from this town than from all the cities since creation. Over the next 50 years, half of Constantinople was boxed up, crated, and shipped out of the city to Venice and the West. At the very heart of Venice, the
Between the State Palace and St Mark's, the old state church, is the city's ancient treasury. And the root of that treasure was the plunder of Byzantium.
It was Europe's pawn shop, really. Emperors left their crowns here for cash. The King of France actually bought the crown of thorns from this room. And in the 1790s, when Napoleon and his armies turned up in Italy, he was able to take 1/2 ton of gold from this room and melt it down just to pay his troops. But despite all of that, despite all the losses, this is still the single place in all the world when you can get a glimmer, just a flash of the treasure that once filled Byzantium.
A glass bowl, enamelled with classic images, taken from the emperor's own quarters in the palace. From the palace chapels, the cups of the imperial communion. A golden icon of St Michael, studded with Indian emeralds. The Byzantines used its glowing colours to foretell the future. This too came from the palace, probably from the chambers of a queen. Inside St Mark's as well, the altars filled with the holy relics looted from Constantinople. This superb Madonna, Venice's most holy icon, had been carried into battle by the Emperor Alexis Murzouflos. The Venetians tore it from his abandoned war chariot.
It's not just the inside of St Mark's that's filled with the plunder of Byzantium. The whole outside of the cathedral is covered in stones stripped from the churches of Constantinople and shipped by the Venetian navy.
A great new balcony was built from the stones of old Byzantium, and 4 bronze horses, said to have come from the very heart of Constantinople, were set up high upon it. St Mark's was plated with the plunder of Byzantium. Today, the old brick church has all but disappeared beneath the foreign marble. Shiploads of columns from Constantinople now decorate the doorways of the church. These beautiful square pillars from an ancient church that had stood on the main highway of Constantinople were used as gallows. The Venetians hung criminals from them. Other fragments of this lost masterpiece once stood in Crusader chapels from Spain to Austria.
This is an interesting piece. It has an amazing history. You see, when the Venetians first took the sculpture from the boat, they found that one of the feet had been broken off. So they made a new foot out of a lighter, whiter stone. You see that? Now, just a few years ago in Istanbul, a Turkish archaeologist actually dug up the original foot. So now we know where this sculpture came from. It came from a monument of Constantine the Great, the first king of Byzantium, and those were his 4 sons. Think of that. We have bits and pieces here from all ages, all styles. This stone is from Egypt, others are from Syria, from Greece. All that style, that richness that went into Byzantium then has gone to make the city of Venice itself.
Byzantium didn't just make Venice beautiful. All the courts of Western Europe now held the plunder of Constantinople. Objects whose hypnotic sparkle crackled through Western Europe. In modern Germany, the little town of Limburg still holds one of these most alien objects. A piece of the cross on which Christ was crucified, transformed by a Byzantine into one of the world's great jewels, and then carried off to Germany by Heinrich von Ullmann, a crusading knight.
In 1235, when this church was just being finished and the Crusaders were still ruling in Constantinople, that doorway would have been surrounded by the ill, the mad and the crippled and the poor. They weren't just standing there waiting for handouts. What was going on was something rather unusual. Inside this church, inside all churches in Western Europe where there was a relic of a saint, there was a special power. This power came actually from heaven, and in lieu of hospitals, that was the best thing these people would hope for, was a cure. After all, Jesus had cured the poor. Now, saints were denominated as holy men by two things: by the actions of their lives and by the fact that their bodies didn't decay. So the little fragments of bone and flesh were very important. When people went up to their shrines and touched them, they were in touch, you might say, with a little bit of heaven, as if there was a hole in the holy ozone that you could reach up through heaven, through the words of the priests and the incense and the music, and some of these blessings could rain down upon you.
The relics of Byzantium, though, weren't relics of local saints. They'd been brought from the Holy Land. They were the personal possessions, some of the very things that Jesus and Mary had touched, and they were never used to cure the poor. These holy things were held in the imperial churches and in the palaces of Byzantium. In that extraordinary world halfway between earth and heaven, they confirmed the divine role of the emperor on earth. By stealing these powerful objects from Constantinople, the pious kings of Western Europe had gained a confidence they'd never had before.
This then, that taking of the relics, was the taking of the holiness of the divine right of kings, the beginning of Western Europe, of Eurocentricity, and almost, you might say, of the modern world.
Back at Constantinople, the Crusaders' colonial administration failed. The knights couldn't balance the books. Driven by debts and petty wars, they left for home. On August the 15th, in the year 1260, a new emperor, Michael VIII, walked in solemn procession through the ancient gates, dressed in the imperial robes of silk and gold, with his choirs, his soldiers and all his priests. Safe inside, he addressed the adoring people of the city, who'd laboured under foreign rule for 50 years and now celebrated the return of Christ's true emperor to the very centre of the earth.
A while ago, God was angry with us and made the west into a great wind that blew us from our city, and we lived like the birds beneath the branches of a tree. But just as he'd promised Abraham the promised land, just as he granted my ancestors eternal victory, so he has given me back the sacred city. Michael might have thought that God had put Byzantium back into the centre of the cosmos. The truth was, the Crusaders had wrecked Constantinople, plundered it, broken it, destroyed it, and the emperor's return to great power politics was suicidal.
Michael and his Byzantines didn't know that, though. As Michael said, they thought that God had restored the cosmic balance, that the golden dream was up and running as before. In the imperial chapel, in the gallery of St. Sophia, their artists made a celebratory mosaic for the emperor's return. Jesus, Mary, and St. John the Baptist. You'd think the world had never changed. Just 20 feet away, A stone is said to mark the grave of the Venetian who led the Western armies to Constantinople. Enricus Dandolo, the man who broke Byzantium. His bones, they said, were thrown out the window into the street, and even the dogs wouldn't eat them. The great mosaic, though, humane, transcendent, optimistic, is the finest single work of all Byzantium's mosaic masters. See how it takes the light. The court of heaven shimmers in the church. This is the Christ the Byzantines had always worshipped. Not a Western Christ upon a cross impaled in dismal earthly history, but the old Eastern Christ, Christ of all times and of all places, Christ of the palace, Christ of Kiev and of Venice, Christ, Lord of Byzantium. The same Christ, too, whose relics and whose images now filled the churches and imagination of the West. The Christ whose soft, impassive face would watch his Eastern Empire gently fade away. This is the story of the ending of a civilization, of the breaking of a way of life, the story of a nation facing extinction, and of the choices that its people made. The story of the ending of the Empire of Byzantium and of the beginnings of the modern world. The last years of the Empire of Byzantium were filled with stress and beauty. Faced with enemies, looking for friends, and always waiting for the ending. As it fell, Byzantium's ornaments, its arts and peoples settled on the West like sparks from a burning forest. Sparks that lit the Western world.
I'm standing high above the Golden Horn in Istanbul, in modern Turkey. I'm standing right on the edge of Europe too. That's Asia over there. Now 800 years ago, from here to the Great Blue Sea was the most famous palace in the world. Its wealth, its beauty, its sacredness was the envy of people from Iceland to China.
Only the angels in heaven, the Byzantines had said, knew the date of the ending of this dazzling city, the capital of the Empire of Byzantium, which they called Constantinople. Late in the Middle Ages, though, in the last 2 centuries of Byzantium, when the Crusaders had half destroyed the city, and with the armies of the Turkish sultans closing in upon its walls, you didn't need to be an angel to know the end was very close. The broken Empire of Byzantium prepared to face its destiny.
The emperors moved their palace here, to Vlachani, right on the city walls. Here they could face all their enemies, the Turks, the Westerners. Here too was a great church and a most sinister prison, where half a dozen emperors were executed or blinded in terrifying family feuds. Just like the emperors, Jesus, Mary and all the saints had also moved out onto the city walls. This is the great monastery church of St. Saviour in Cora, St. Saviour in the fields. In the last centuries of Byzantium, the city's greatest icons were in this church, waiting to be paraded round the walls in times of siege.
St. Saviour's was Byzantium's last masterwork, the jewel box set beside the city walls. Inside these little city churches, many people found their individual answers to the most terrible dilemma that any culture has to face: the threat of annihilation, of the death of a nation. The imperial crown was stored here, alongside the holy pictures. It's said that on the last night of Byzantium, on the 28th of May 1453, as the Emperor Constantine Palaeologus was praying, the Virgin Mary came down from heaven and asked him to return the crown to her, as God withdrew protection from his holy city. Above the door in shining gold, an image of the church's greatest benefactor, Theodore Metochites, Prime Minister and High Chancellor of Byzantium. Look at him with his turban and his caftan. The very model of an Eastern gentleman. Yet Theodore and the Byzantines were a very ancient people, the living remnants of the world of Greece and Rome. Even by Theodore's day, though, by the 1320s, the great Chancellor had come to the conclusion that Byzantium's ancient heritage was quite exhausted, that all one really had to do was to wait and pray and silently endure. His church is a meditation on eternity. Many Byzantines believed that if an enemy ever broke through these vast old city walls, the very statues of the ancient emperors would come alive and drive the invaders from the city. For them, Constantinople was a sacred city, the centre of the world, inviolable. Yet they too could see the Turkish armies drawing ever closer and their ancient city descending into ruin. By the 1400s, many of Byzantium's brightest minds had left the gathering gloom and darkness of the crumbling city and settled in a fresh new town beneath the mountain tops of southern Greece. A sparkling town on a hilltop close to the ruins of ancient Sparta, a town called Mistra. A miniature kingdom ruled by the emperor's brother Theodore and Queen Cleope, his Italian wife, where Jews and Greeks, Byzantines and Italians, Greek and Latins could live happily together. One of the lovely things about Mistra is how small it is, how tiny, how human. Everything here is democratic. As you walk down the street, you'd have bumped into everybody. You might have seen Italian merchants. You might have seen beautiful Queen Cleope walking amongst the flowers. And you might have seen the retired Emperor John, here to visit his family, now a monk buzzing busily from church to church. At the hub of Mistra's life was a charismatic teacher from Constantinople, a follower of Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, a man called Plethon.
In Plethon's time, Mystra was already famous. It was a little paradise, they said. The men were handsome, the women were beautiful, and the stones were from ancient Sparta itself. But everybody knew that they were doomed.
Here, Plethon founded the last academy of Greek philosophy. Here, he taught future patriarchs of Constantinople and future cardinals of the Church of Rome as well. As they mingled with the philosophers of late Byzantium, for a brief while, Western visitors to Mystra witnessed the last flowering of the living world of ancient Greece.
At the heart of Mystra was the court. And at the heart of the court, this little pretty church, named after the great old court church of Constantinople, St. Sophia. There's not much left here now. Just Christ up there on the wall, and a few beautiful fragments of marble. Most of the church has been stripped out completely. There's even a little double-headed eagle still up there, the double-headed eagle of the last emperors of Byzantium. But the real treasure is here on the floor. Look at this. See that? That stone there, that purple stone, that's imperial porphyry. That's a stone, well, it's the half-magical stone of Byzantium. When this church was built, it hadn't even been mined for 1,000 years, yet little chippings of it were taken around the world and set in floors like this. It was the stone in which Roman emperors had been born in rooms that were covered in it. This, though, is probably the very stone where the last emperor of Byzantium was crowned. Constantine Palaeologus, the last ruler of Mystra, was crowned here on the 6th of January 1449. 3 years later, he died fighting on the walls of Constantinople as the Turks took the city.
In the 13th century, a family of nomad Turkish shepherds called the Ottomans packed their tents and rode out of Central Asia. 2 centuries later, the Islamic armies of the Ottoman Turks, commanded by members of that same family, had conquered most of the territory of Byzantium and a large part of Southeast Europe too. The centre of this enlarging Turkish empire was a city at the borders of modern Greece and Turkey, the city of Edirne, the capital of the Turkish sultans. In those days, Edirne was a hectic international city, the city of great mosques, hospitals, concert halls, munitions works, and grand bazaars.
This is one of the colleges of learning at Edirne. In Sultan Mehmet's time, there were many of them here, and they formed a circle like a university around the court. It was an international university. There were Italians here teaching the Sultan's children how to speak Greek. Byzantine nobles sometimes sent their children here for a good education. Old Plethon came here as a young man. Here it was he met Persian fire worshippers who taught him all about their strange religion. Here it was too. He first read the works of the ancient Greek Aristotle. Clearly this dynamic, international, rich, powerful society was far more than a match for the poor old empire of Byzantium.
It was also clear But the ancient city of Constantinople had been engulfed by this adolescent multinational empire, that Constantinople lay at the strategic centre of its trade routes and on the supply lines of the Turkish armies that were eating into Eastern Europe. That is why Byzantium was doomed. In 1438, the Emperor John VIII sailed out of Constantinople in a last attempt to beg aid from the reluctant West in his struggle with the Turks. After 77 days at sea, the imperial convoy arrived at the friendly port of Venice. The West had always said that military aid for Constantinople was dependent upon Byzantium's reunion with the Church of Rome. The churches of the East and West, Greek and Latin, had split apart 6 centuries before. So the Emperor John had sailed with his theologians and his bishops, not his generals or his admirals. In all, some 700 people on the sea, the scholars of Byzantium. Plethon, too, had come especially from Mystra in Greece, as had many of his pupils.
The most extraordinary thing about this gathering, that there were bishops and priests from all the cities of the ancient East, all the cities founded by Greece and Rome, the cities of Alexander the Great, the cities of the 7 wonders of the world, all had their representatives at the council, all at once and all together. It was as if the old world had come to meet the new.
But there was plague abroad in northern Italy. 2 Byzantine bishops perished in the first weeks of negotiations. The emperor and his retinue rode away from danger, over the mountains and down to the central plain of Italy. Here, perhaps, at Florence, they might forge that union with the West that Byzantium so desperately needed. And here, too, they were memorialised in the frescoes of Benozzo Gozzoli, painted in the townhouse of the Medici family, the bankers who were sponsoring this Council of the Churches.
That's John VIII, John Palaeologus from Mystra, Emperor of Byzantium, come to the West to seek aid. He'd ruled 12 years at this point. When he got here, the Florentines, those dedicated followers of fashion, thought he was a knockout. They had never seen turbans like that or crowns like that. The jewellers liked it. The Florentine weavers liked it. The painters liked it. This was a man whose dress and demeanour influenced fashion here almost for a century. They didn't like him much, though. They thought all the Greeks were haughty, sarcastic people who seemed to be laughing at jokes that they wouldn't share with the Florentines. Didn't like them at all, really. What they were experiencing, actually, was a typical Greek thing. It was the full force of the divine right of kings. See, in the West that had rather diminished. The West that had pinched the idea of the emperor had now taken to electing Western emperors. They were confirmed by popes. There was common law, power in the West that seeped down and down and down away from the man who now was like only at the top of a vast pyramid of power. In Byzantium, everything resided in the one man. Now, in the West, and here it is, out for a stroll in the country, Cosimo and the other 700 Medici, all on their horses. This is entirely reversed. I mean, here you've got a man who is a banker, a politician, a multinational businessman, you might say. The West was entirely different.
The central disagreement, then, was about these different attitudes to power in East and West, about power and precedence amongst the lords of earth and heaven. Most of the Byzantines, though, were insulted at the very idea of arguing about God, whose majesty and dignity was beyond all human understanding. They thought that the clever Roman clerics they faced each day were simply impertinent and immature. After a year of recrimination and debate, the Emperor John, still desperate for military aid, simply ordered his delegation to agree to most of the West's arguments.
On the 6th of June, 1439, a great act of union was signed in Florence Cathedral, right under the huge, beautiful, brand new dome. An act of union between two churches, between the Pope of Rome and his assembled clergy, the Emperor of Byzantium, and whichever of his Greeks decided to turn up that day.
Back at Constantinople, though, the union with Rome caused riots. Italian priests were insulted in the city's churches, and Western Europe sent no aid. Disillusioned, disappointed, the Emperor John died a few years later and was buried here in the monastery of Christ Pantocrator, Christ, Lord of earth and heaven. And at this same monastery, Gennadius the theologian preached that the union with Rome would bring down the wrath of God upon Byzantium. Meanwhile, at Edirne, a new young Turkish sultan, Mehmet, had taken up the Ottoman throne. At Constantinople, the new emperor, John's brother, Constantine, soon discovered that he now had a dangerous and most impatient neighbour.
In April 1452, there was a huge row at the court of Sultan Mehmet II. Byzantine ambassadors had turned up complaining that the young man was breaking all his father's treaties. He was too. He was building a huge castle right next door to Constantinople called the Cutthroat. It was the first stages in his planned attack upon the city. And now, in his reply to these ambassadors, he tried to scare the pants off them. Listen to this, these are his very words. "Have you the right or the power to control my actions on my own territory? Inform your king that I am very different from my father, that my resolution surpasses all my ancestors. This time, you can return in safety, but the next man who delivers a similar message to me will be flayed alive."
Back in Constantinople, the new emperor, Constantine XI, reluctantly composed his reply. "It is clear," he said to the Sultan, "that you desire war more than peace, so let that be your desire. I release you from all your oaths and treaties with me, and in closing the gates of my city, I tell you I will defend my people to the last drop of blood." The Turkish mosques in Byzantium were shut. The Turkish troops who were sightseeing in the city were thrown out the gates. Byzantium was at war. Mehmet was actually very touched by Constantine. After all, the Ottomans and Byzantines had lived side by side for a very long time. They'd fought together in wars, they'd intermarried. But Mehmet was also very determined. Listen to his reply. "I shall take your city," he tells Constantine, "or the city will take me. If, however, you admit defeat and withdraw, I will give you Mistra and its province, and we shall be friends. If you deny me peaceful entry, however, I shall slay you and all your nobles. I shall slaughter the inhabitants of your city and allow my troops to plunder it. The city itself is all I want, even if it is empty." Constantine's reply was brief. You may have anything you want of me other than the city. I will not flee from it, nor will I evacuate. You may have anything but the city. For the city I would rather die than live. On the evening of the 28th, the Sultan Mehmet addressed his armies standing assembled outside the city walls. I give you, he said, the capital of the ancient Romans, the summit of power and glory, the centre of the world. I give over to you the men, women and children of this city, its gold and silver, its silks and furs. All I want are the buildings and the walls. It really was the standard offer of a medieval commander to his troops before the final assault. And they roared in agreement. There is but one God, they said, and Muhammad is his prophet. On the fringe of empire, high in the mountains of northern Romania, contemporary Byzantine artists made precious records of the fall of Constantinople. Here's the Turkish armies, waiting for Mehmet to order the final assault upon the city. The cannons, large as dragons it was said, brought down from Edirne to pulverise the city's vast old walls. The Turkish navy, fighting all along the Golden Horn, forcing the tiny armies of the Byzantines to fight on two fronts at once. On the city walls, the Byzantines parade the holy icon of the Virgin, the city's sacred shield, just as they had done for 1,000 years and more. Every hole, each crack and weakness in the ancient walls is strengthened by the prayers of priests, the women and the children. There's the emperor, ordering the walls repair with rocks and stones, and the empress too with her ladies. Here though, the artist is in error. There was no queen. Constantine XI, Constantine of Mistra, was childless and a widower. The last emperor would leave no heir. On the last day of Byzantium, an eerie quiet fell over the city. Mehmet had told the Turks to rest for a whole day before the last assault. He gave the emperor time to walk with all that was left of the armies and nobles of Byzantium once again into the great church, and there, after all their arguing at Florence, the Greeks and the Latins joined together in a last service, and the emperor went to the altar and was given the last rites. Then he walked back to the palace, and there he made a speech to his commanders. A speech, you might say, that was the last speech of the ancient world. He encouraged them not to be frightened when the Turks attacked. He said that their ancestors, the ancient Romans, were terrified when Hannibal's elephants had charged towards them, that they hadn't run away. Because they were human beings, people with will and mind, and not given to animal desires, and that he and his commanders had mind and will and God and belief upon their side. It was those beliefs of mind that stem back to Greece and Rome and fuel the modern world. And then Constantine, the 11th of that name, went with his men back to the outskirts of his empire, to the walls now of his city. And there he died, the ruler of Rome, the king of Christendom, and the emperor of Byzantium. What actually happened to him is a mystery. Turkish historians tell us only that the emperor was very brave. The Constantine died fighting by the city gates. "The city is taken," he's supposed to have cried, "and I'm still alive." And he ran off towards the battle and into the flash of legend. The man then killed 10 pashas and 60 soldiers with his lance, and at the end poor Constantine was toppled from his horse and cried to God Almighty, the creator of the universe. And the Turks cut off his head and stuck it on a pole. As he rode through the streets of Constantinople on the first day of the Turkish conquest, Sultan Mehmet found whole districts of the sacred city derelict and abandoned, saw hovels and graveyards built amongst the ruins of its legendary palaces. He was awed, though, by the imperial church of St. Sophia, and declared its venerable shell to be a building made for God. So the church of St. Sophia, the church of the divine wisdom, was converted to the mosque of Hagia Sophia, the mosque of the divine wisdom. Images of old Byzantium had glimmered at the edge of Asia for 1,000 years. Now new ghosts, new legends and new peoples came to haunt its fabled stones. Legend tells that Mehmet rode into St. Sophia on his war horse and placed his finger in this magic column and spun the church around to face Mecca for the call to prayer. History tells that the Sultan ordered the tomb of Constantine the Great, the founder of Byzantium, to be demolished, along with the burial church of the ancient emperors, and this great mosque, the funerary mosque of Mehmet the Conqueror, was put up in its place. Yet Mehmet, a humane and sympathetic man, still wondered at this ancient ruined city and its unyielding inhabitants. The most eminent Byzantine left alive inside the city was Gennadius the theologian. Mehmet visited him here, in the monastery of Christ Pantocrator. Who were the people of this crumbling ancient city, the Sultan asked him, and what exactly was their faith?
Like most of the inhabitants of this most stubborn city, Gennadius would only answer for himself. You may not call me a Greek, he said, because I do not believe as those ancient pagan people once believed. You might call me a Byzantine, because I was born in this city. But I prefer simply to call myself a Christian. He might also have added that he considered himself to be an exclusive member, a leading light of the society that was God's kingdom on this earth. Mehmet was pleased enough with the old boy's answer to give the penniless church a bag of gold, make Gennadius its leader, to give him a white mule, and to give him authority too over all the Christians of his empire. It was an arrangement that lasted for 4 centuries. As for Gennadius' beloved monastery, well, its church became a madrasa, an Islamic public school, and one Zarek became a very famous preacher in this city. Now, when Mehmet first came to the church, his quick eye had noticed a great line of stone sarcophagi along the aisle there. In fact, they were the tombs, the sarcophagi, of the last kings of Byzantium. John of Florence was buried here, his brother, their queens. These he took for his new palace in the city. He also took a slab of stone
laid in that trench over there. For centuries, pilgrims had believed that that had been the very slab of stone on which the body of the Lord Jesus Christ had laid after the crucifixion. They said you could still see Mary's tears upon it, glistening like pearls. Over the centuries, Zayrek's school became a mosque. The district became quite poor. The mosque sold off its great white shining marble pillars and put in these baulks of stone instead. And the great screen, the altar screen from the church, whose golden panels now stand on the high altar of St. Mark's in Venice, were turned into that, a minbar, a pulpit for reading the Quran. So it all seems to have gone, doesn't it? But there's still something here. If you lift the carpets of the mosque and go through to the ancient floor underneath, then you'll see a memory of Imperial Byzantium. There are still descendants of the Byzantines today, a dwindling community at the ancient heart of one of the largest cities in the modern world. Their worship in this sole-surviving ancient church is guaranteed by the proclamations of ancient sultans hanging on its walls. Their church has survived schism and poverty. For a while, the deep distrust of Rome led them towards Calvinism. But here they are still, in their holy city, with their own faith. Scattered too, through myriads of monasteries and far-flung churches, pale shadows of the ancient earthly empire of Byzantium. Most of Constantinople's ancient churches, though, were soon converted into mosques. This little mosque was once a chapel in the ancient palace of Byzantium. Endowed with lands and properties, these converted churches were transformed into self-financing charitable trusts, the religious and financial centres of the city's neighbourhoods, and the means by which Constantinople was converted to Islam and revived. Under Turkish rule, Constantinople was to become a rich and thriving city once again, the centre of a mighty empire, just as it had been 1,000 years before. Just before the conquest of Constantinople, a radical young bishop called Bessarion, Plethon's most brilliant pupil, had returned to Italy and had been made a cardinal of Rome. Some historians detect his portrait in this tragic bearded figure talking with Italian friends, chic young men of the Renaissance, painted by Piero della Francesca. Here at Rome, Bessarion did what Byzantines had done at Constantinople for centuries. He made a villa by the city walls. This villa, one of the first in the modern Western world. A memory of old Byzantium. Bessarion spent his life making a memorial for Byzantium by founding an academy of scholars.
You know, I suppose Bessarion bought his academy here when it got very hot in the summer months. This academy was a group of people who he'd gathered around him. Some were exiled Byzantines, many of them were Europeans, but everybody who could help him hold the identity of Byzantium together for as long as possible. Poets, artists, writers, translators, all sorts of people. Couldn't have been that difficult to find people, because this was a really fashionable idea. Dear old Plethon had introduced Plato to the West. The Renaissance was beginning. This is early Renaissance building. For a few years, this was the coolest place on the planet. So you've got to think, perhaps, that this was the place too where one day in the summer 1452, Bessarion sat down to write to Mistra. He was writing a letter of condolence to Plethon's sons.
The old man had died with the spring flowers in June of that year. Bessarion wrote a letter, such a letter. He said that Plethon had been his teacher, his father and his friend. It was one of the last authentic letters of the ancient world. After that, Byzantium became something to be seen in libraries and museums. Above all, Bessarion preserved the dream. He gathered the pure air of Mistra, the ideals of Constantinople, the energy of ancient wisdom, and made a single beauteous image of that most complicated empire. The West had seen nothing like this flood of wisdom that was pouring from Byzantium. Homer, ancient Roman law, and a myriad of other texts. And they'd seen nothing like Bessarion's academy. Part of the modern world, its science and its scholarship, was started by these exiles from Byzantium. Plethon and Bessarion first taught the West old Plato's heady individualism that so fills the modern world. Bessarion, too, told a Westerner about an ancient text that inspired Columbus to sail west from Europe on the east wind to America. There is, though, a deeper and yet more fundamental legacy. A vision of a universal order that stretches back through Byzantium, through Roman Greece to the Bible and the most ancient East. A vision that still fills the world today. A vision that exiled Byzantine artists drew out for us in dazzling detail at Voronezh, the most beautiful of Romania's lonely monasteries.
See that cross there in the middle? That's the cross of our Lord standing on the holy throne of Byzantium, the centre of the world. To the left is good, paradise. There's all the lords and ladies of Byzantium pressing through the pearly gates. On the right, hell, the Turks and everybody else, all the bad people struggling to get out.
Good and bad, plus and minus, past and future, with heaven above and hell below, and pure energy at the centre. A structured universal order that the modern world still understands and uses every day.
And if there's nothing there that you can see from the modern world, just look at those demons, as black as SS officers, prodding their victims towards the ovens. That's a hell we've made reality. And look at that over there in paradise, the tree of life, the centre of man's wisdom, the very plant that the god Gilgamesh 6,000 years ago in ancient Ur in Mesopotamia searched for. To him, the elixir of life was understanding. For us, perhaps, it's penicillin.
then again, there's something here that's unique. Above all the bustle of the world, the lords and ladies, the gods and demons, coming through and behind the very scroll of time itself, the Lord of the universe. The heart of the atom, heaven's order in a grain of sand. Byzantium's fundamental legacy, this image of a universal structure, a universal order, is as basic to the order of the modern world as is DNA to every individual in it. Nowadays, Constantinople, the heart of old Byzantium, is called Istanbul, an old Byzantine phrase that simply means the city. Inside the modern city, though, the past is disappearing.
Ruins are often melancholy, but they should seldom make you angry. The end of Byzantium wasn't really brought about by the wicked West or the terrible Turk. Things pass, as the poet said. If the cowboys had never shot the Indians, the Great Plains would not be filled with shining teepees and herds of buffaloes. Nonetheless, we should honour the past and cherish it. It's a memory, a solid memory of our beginnings. And think of Byzantium too, as a flash of silver, as a dream of jewels. There's an image of a god sitting on a golden throne and of an emperor sitting in this palace in his imitation. Think of the culture that gave us the rule of Roman law, and the image of a holy mother, much beloved, caressing a baby child. And think of Byzantium too, this extraordinary empire set between the East and West, whose very ending set those two things far apart, but in whose own time gave so many good ideas to both of them.
When sailing from Byzantium, listen to the city's fading sounds. Visit in your mind its golden images and all the shadows of its history. And as you wave goodbye, you'll discover that you can never really leave the past behind.